Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. As you probably already know, this is part 2 of our 3-part series that we are doing with the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance. Today's session is on Envision Illinois, uniting disability and domestic violence services to achieve safety, justice, and healing. Our speaker is Krescene Beck, and she is with the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance. She provides organizational advocacy support for the Alliance. And as a licensed nursing home administrator and former executive vice president of a large disability service agency, Krescene has spent the last 16 years working on statewide grants focused on self-advocacy and on building collaborations to better respond to people with disabilities who experience violence. Krescene specializes in creating opportunities for self-advocates to find and use their voices to live their best lives. She also serves as co-director with Blue Tower Solutions Incorporated. Again, this webinar is being recorded and it will be housed on our YouTube page. I will share this with members so they can view it and share it with their board members if they weren't able to join us. And we can ask questions. Krescene, are we doing that before? I mean, during, or you want to wait till?
That's a great question. Thanks, Jody. There are a couple of opportunities for you to type things into the chat box. And then if you really have a question you'd like to ask during our time together, go ahead and ask it. Otherwise, we'll have some time at the end of the presentation.
Okay, well, with that, thanks, Krescene, for joining us again. We appreciate it, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Krescene Beck. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'll give a brief visual description. I am a person with light pink skin. I have, lighter brown short hair, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. In the interest of accessibility, now that I have done my visual description, I am going to turn my camera off and I will start to share my screen. Okay. Well, let me see here because, all right, there we go. So can everyone see my screen?
Not yet. It came up and it
then
went.
it left. Okay, so all right, let me try something. You know, if we didn't have some technology difficulties, we just wouldn't be happy, would we?
There we go.
All right. Now, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So Jody, during the time when we're having some put into the chat box, if you could read those out loud for me, please. I'm not able to see them. So welcome everyone. During our time together, we are going to learn about Envision Illinois, uniting disability and domestic violence services to achieve safety, justice, and healing. I'd like to acknowledge that the grant, the Envision Illinois grant, was awarded by the Office of Violence Against Women through the U.S. Department of Justice. It was awarded in 2013. It was a 10-year project, and we are currently still going on a no-cost extension. I'd also like to share a trigger warning. We are going to be talking about domestic violence in its various forms, and that can include abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation. We are going to be watching a video and hearing from 2 self-advocates who experienced domestic violence. If you find yourself being triggered by this information, please practice self-care. Step away from the presentation. Do what you need to do. Get a drink of water. Go outside. Whatever you need to do to practice self-care. And then if you are able, return to the presentation. So I'm going to get started with some interactivity. I'd like you to write your answer in the chat box. Do you think domestic violence against people with disabilities and deaf people is a problem? You can type in yes, you believe it to be a big problem. You can type in not really, it rarely occurs. Maybe you type in no, it's not a problem, or you're not sure. So again, type into the chat box your answer for this question. Do you think domestic violence against people with disabilities and deaf people is a problem?
Looks like we have mostly yes, and we have one not sure.
All right. Thank you so much for engaging with that. When we started this grant back in 2013, we thought that domestic violence against people with disabilities and deaf people was a problem. We heard stories from self-advocates who had experienced domestic violence, and that was one of the foundational things for our Envision Illinois grant. So let's talk a little bit about domestic violence and people with disabilities. And I'd like to share with you the power of a survivor's words. And in this video, you will meet Keisha Weller and James Meadows. Both Keisha and James experienced domestic violence at hands of people they knew. For Keisha, it was a friend, a coworker that she had worked with. For James, it was a paid caregiver. Again, this comes with a trigger warning. If you begin to be triggered, please step away and practice safe care. This video lasts about 4 minutes.
Keisha, I'm James Meadows from San Antonio, Texas.
Hi, my name is Keisha Weller from Los Angeles, California. Nice to meet you, James.
I think it's a good step we're doing today about talking about sexual violence because a long time ago, no one was talking about it.
That's very true because when I first reported my rape, I felt shame, and I was told that if I told anybody, I'll get beaten up by the rapist.
In 2005, when I got assaulted, finally got the courage to stand up for myself because I got the self-advocacy skills to stand up for myself. But I did not realize someday that I'm going to be an advocate for others who've been sexually assaulted.
Yeah, I know what you mean because in a long time ago, somewhere about 2005, I reported my rape to my service provider, my independent living skills agency, and they got me help for my rape. And I feel empowered right now to help other self-advocates. I think we could do so much more, but what I want to impress to everybody, all the self-advocates out there, is that it takes courage to report sexual violence to authorities and to get help. But once you do, you get healing.
I was lucky that the same nurse who is the sexual assault nurse examiner told me that it's not my fault, James. It's not your fault. It's the perpetrator's fault.
That's very true, James, because when I got raped, I thought I was blaming myself because I was raped. I had brought the perpetrator into my house, the rapist. But now I know rape is never the fault of the victim. It's the fault of the perpetrator. And that's very important for everybody to understand.
I hope someday we don't have to talk about it. That's my dream and vision, is we don't have to talk about it. I think the other thing we need to somehow tell parents and also the people who are supposed to support us and the caregivers to have a better understanding to be there for us and not cause judgment onto us.
That's a very good point, James.
I'm so glad we have a chance to visit, Keisha.
Thanks a lot, James. I greatly appreciate it.
Just take a moment and breathe in. And what powerful stories and words. And we want to thank Keisha and James for their courage in sharing it publicly. Anytime a survivor shares their story, we want to remember several important points. The first, these stories are a gift. They enable us to walk alongside the survivor and give us a window into their experiences and feelings. We want to make sure to create an environment that respects the survivor and centers the learning on their experiences. The second, these stories hold great power. As we listen to them, we may find the assumptions we make about people rising to the surface. And I'd like to assist you to examine these assumptions and identify where they may create obstacles to providing a trauma-informed, survivor-centered response. And the last, no two stories are alike. Each story can help you understand both small and large themes that resonate through the lives of people with disabilities and deaf people. And those themes can contribute to the ongoing culture of violence they experience. In the later part of our time today, we'll be identifying gaps and locating support and steps that you can take to connect survivors to resources. Now, keeping Keisha and James's stories in mind, we're going to take a closer look at what do we mean when we talk about domestic violence. So the image on the screen is the roof line outline of a house and different types of domestic violence within that roof line of the house. Domestic violence occurs in the context of relationships. For Keisha, it was a friend that she worked with. She invited to her home to play chess, and it was kind of like a chess date, and that person took advantage of that invitation and sexually assaulted her. Dating violence is one type of domestic violence. In James's story, it was a paid caregiver. That's another type of domestic violence. So under the roofline of this household, we show how domestic violence can occur within a variety of relationships. And that's the key. Domestic violence occurs within relationships. Those relationships include dating violence for both teens and adults, violence within family relationships, including parent to child, intimate partners, spouses, and it also includes in the caregiving support given to older adults and people with disabilities. So as we started the Envision Illinois grant, we heard from self-advocates, people with disabilities and deaf people who shared their experiences, who gave us the gift of the stories. We knew that we needed to have some data. And so we'll look at some prevalence. 92%, or 1 out of 10 women with disabilities, rank violence and abuse as the top priority of topics that affected their lives. The risk of being physically or sexually assaulted for adults with developmental or intellectual disabilities is 4 to 10 times as high as it is for other adults. Some studies indicate the level of sexual victimization to be 50% of all deaf individuals, as compared to 25% of hearing females and 10% of hearing males prior to adulthood. The U.S. Department of Justice began collecting statistics on crimes against people with disabilities in 2009. And the graph on this slide shows the rate of violent victimization for people with and people without disabilities each year up to 2019. So this is a 10-year period of time. And People with disabilities experience a excuse me, a higher rate of victimization. It started a little under 30% per 1,000 people. It went down, then it went up, went down, and it started to raise again. That's the top, more heavily, I don't know what to call it, the dotted line, the darker dotted line. The lighter dotted line represents people without disabilities, and their rate of violent victimization pretty much remained unchanged. Now, what we don't have statistics for yet is the times during COVID, when people were isolated, when people could not get out, when it was a time of high stress. We know from stories that people shared with us that domestic violence occurred more often in their lives during that time. We just don't have the numbers for that at this particular point. And we also know from data that very few of the people harming individuals are strangers. More often, they are known to the person, such as family members or people involved in a support capacity. That's domestic violence. Women with disabilities, as compared to women without disabilities, are more likely to experience violence that is more severe. They experience it for a longer duration. They're survivors of multiple episodes and be survivors of a larger number of perpetrators. And so you can see how trauma can accumulate for people. And as you saw in the video, Keisha, a woman, experienced domestic violence, and James, a man, experienced domestic violence. The final data that I'll share with you is from the Illinois Department on Aging's Adult Protective Services 2021 annual report. There were 20,567 reports of abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation of older adults age 60 or older and people with disabilities. So Adult Protective Services, they investigate reports of abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation of older adults, people age 60 and older, and people with disabilities living in the community. And the top reports were financial exploitation. So the bottom line is this: as we were hearing the stories and we are looking at statistics, people with disabilities experience domestic and sexual violence at alarming rates, and yet they are less likely to receive services, supports, and justice than their counterparts without disabilities receive. It's at that intersection that Envision Illinois comes into being. And so first, let's look at power and control. When we think about domestic violence, it is about power and control. And victim services have had power and control wheels for quite a long time. And this power and control wheel is unique. It took the original power and control wheel and it adapted it for people with disabilities. This was done in 2011 by Project Peer, and it demonstrates the power and control that people with disabilities and deaf people may experience. It can be sexual, emotional, physical. It includes force and threats, bullying, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children. It includes economic abuse and staff and relationship roles, such as taking or withholding needed support. Excuse me. With domestic violence, the individual uses power and control to not only start the abusive relationship, but to maintain that abusive relationship. First, they gain trust and they work to fulfill a need, creating dependency. Then oftentimes they can start to isolate the person from their supports, whether that's family or friends or other supports. And then using carefully designed behavior, they maintain control. And that can look like Keisha's friend who gained her trust over working with her for several years. And when he was able to isolate her at her apartment, he assaulted her. Her efforts also to seek justice were thwarted by the man's claims that that sex was consensual. And when Keisha reported it to the authorities, she wasn't believed. So domestic violence doesn't happen out of the blue. Victims are targeted, the environments are targeted, the tactics are customized. A perpetrator may use one set of tactics on one person and another set of tactics on another person. It starts in that trust relationship where they get information. Domestic violence is intentional, it's strategic, it's methodical, and it's goal-oriented, with the only goal being to have power and control over another person. So we know about domestic violence, but where are the solutions? And the great thing is there are solutions, and each of us are part of the solutions, whether we're part of the solution within our professional capacity or we are part of the solution within our personal lives. Maybe we are engaging with a family or a friend. Maybe it's someone within our faith community who discloses to us that they have experienced domestic violence. And this leads to my next question. If you would write into the chat box, do you think survivors with disabilities and deaf survivors access services designed for domestic violence victims? No, they don't. Rarely, yes, or you're not sure. So go ahead and write it into the chat box. Do you think survivors with disabilities and deaf survivors access services designed for domestic violence victims? And Jody, if you let me know what people are typing in, that would be amazing.
Yep, we have a no, and the rest are rarely.
Okay. As we're doing the foundational work for the Envision Illinois grant, we engaged with the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and they keep statistics. So we have statistics from the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Statistics. We also have information from the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And what we saw is they're not really accessing victim services. And there's a couple of reasons that might be so. Again, here's another intersection. We have to get the information out so that people with disabilities and deaf people know services are available. So some of the barriers that contribute to victims with disabilities and deaf victims not accessing services is sometimes the victim doesn't know that what happened to them is abuse. In the developmental disabilities world, we call it abuse and neglect. That's what OIG, Office of the Inspector General, Rule 50 says. That's what the Illinois Department of Public Health regulations say. But really what it is domestic violence. And sometimes victims don't know that what happened to them is abuse. People often don't recognize caregiver abuse as domestic violence. When we ask people what they think of when they think of domestic violence, they typically think of intimate partner or spousal abuse as domestic violence. Those definitely are types of domestic violence, but also is caregiver abuse because it's about that relationship, whether it's a paid caregiver or an unpaid caregiver. That also qualifies as domestic violence. You heard from Keisha that people often don't believe a victim when they report abuse. We heard many stories about law enforcement being called and law enforcement saying, well, you know, she's kind of crazy. We're here at a mental health center. And so we don't even believe that it happened. Whether it is someone trying to disclose to a family or a friend or a support staff or law enforcement, sometimes victims aren't believed. And then we have a lack of accessibility and accommodations that also prove to be barriers. Not just accessibility and accommodations within domestic violence services, but also within the services that we currently provide at our agencies and organizations. So the dichotomy is this: we have a high prevalence. We have a lot of people in terms of data and sharing their stories about domestic violence, and yet there are not as many numbers served as there are people experiencing domestic violence. And so it's important to understand what trauma is. And this is what SAMHSA defines trauma. It's the result of an event, a sequence of events, or a set of circumstances that an individual perceives as physically or emotionally damaging or life-threatening, resulting in lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and overall well-being, including their physical and social spheres and emotional and spiritual aspects. So trauma impacts the whole person. And if we break it down a little bit, trauma is an emotional response to a disturbing event. And that can be any type of event. It can be a car accident. It could be the death of a loved one. It could be a natural disaster. It could be an incident of domestic violence. Trauma occurs when an event overwhelms the ability to cope. And it can be one large incident. It can be an accumulation of smaller events or a combination of events. So we talk about trauma in terms of a big T trauma, this one large incident, or little t trauma, which can be an accumulation of smaller events. Each person reacts differently to a specific event. So there is no right or wrong way to do trauma. Right? What's trauma to one person is not necessarily trauma to another person. And so as we are receiving the gift of stories through disclosures, or as we are thinking about trauma, we need to avoid comparison and judgment. So I often say this in terms of everybody reacts differently to a different event, as how do you sneeze? So are you a person that has a nice dainty sneeze, or are you a person that when you sneeze the whole county knows about it? Right? It's still a sneeze, but there's different ways that people do it. Trauma can have lasting effects on a person's physical, emotional, social, and spiritual well-being. And the earlier in life that trauma is experienced, the more lasting the consequences. I know a lot of people say the body keeps the score, and there's truth to that. We are starting to hear more and more and get more information and data about ACE, or adverse childhood experiences, and how they impact the person and how they impact the growing brain. There's some points that the brain can do neuroplasticity and can move beyond. And there's sometimes that the brain, just the neural pathways are lost. Trauma in people with disabilities, it is widespread. Many people with disabilities have endured a lifetime of trauma that includes a lifetime of people trying to fix them. through our programs and through the very services that we provide. Also, a lifetime of people calling them names. Maybe that's microaggressions, and maybe it's calling them the R word or crazy right to their face. A lifetime of invalidation, being ignored, left out, never having a voice, and a lifetime of having choices taken away or being denied choices. We oftentimes do not provide people with disabilities the dignity of risk. And so the effects of trauma, people can have a lack of sense of safety. I don't know if you have ever experienced a car accident where you were driving a car and somebody rear ends you. I know that I have. And it took a long time after that for me to feel a sense of safety when I was pulling up to a stop sign or pulling up to a stoplight. I was constantly looking in my rear view mirror, just waiting for the car behind me to come in too fast and hit me again. Some people may feel disconnected from others and maybe from themselves because they have a hard time trusting, believing that maybe it's something I did to cause the abuse or neglect or the trauma, or I can't trust this other person not to hurt me. People can feel powerless. They may experience grief over the many losses endured, and they may attempt to present a role of power in order to cover up personal vulnerability. I've heard from perpetrators that they experienced domestic violence earlier in their life, and so they took on the role of power and control in order for other people not to have power and control over them. And so a trauma-informed approach is key to our solutions. And there's three key elements. The first is that we realize there is a prevalence of trauma. We hear it in the stories. We see it in the data. We also recognize how trauma affects all individuals within the programs, the organizations, or the system, including our workforce. And we respond by putting this knowledge into practice. So we realize that there's trauma and we respond to the individual. We recognize how trauma affects all individuals within our programs, and that impacts how we set up services. And we respond by putting that knowledge into practice and how we set up our organizations. And what survivors need to know is this: will I be safe with you? If I disclose to you, am I going to be safe? You heard Keisha say, I was afraid to tell because I didn't want my rapist to beat me up. Can I believe in you to tell me the truth and to be honest? Many people who have experienced domestic violence have had their perpetrator not be honest with them. And then, will you tell me what to do, or will you work with me? Domestic violence is about power and control. People making them do things. And survivors need to know that they will have their own power. And so how do we respond to disclosures? So disclosures are when people tell you that abuse, neglect, or financial exploitation has happened. And that can happen in a lot of different ways. It can be someone coming right out and saying, hey, staff abused me last night. It can sound like this. Maybe you are meeting with a customer or a self-advocate and you are talking about employment, and hey, your employer has said that you've been coming in late to work. Is everything okay? And then they disclose. Disclosures can also sound like this. Perhaps you're meeting with someone and they say, do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend? And you say yes. And then they ask you what you think is a really strange and bizarre question. Do you and your boyfriend do this or that? And maybe your first instinct is to say, that's a real inappropriate question. But maybe what they're trying to do is find out, are you a safe person to tell? Or is what happened to me right? Or is it wrong? So perhaps instead of saying that's really inappropriate, maybe say this. Why do you ask? That way you're not giving your information, but you're trying to find out, why are you asking this? We want to provide privacy. If we are in more of a public location, we want to provide some privacy so the person can speak. We also want to listen without interrupting. It is not our job and our role to investigate and to get all of the facts. It is our role to listen without interrupting. Even if you have to report because you are a mandated reporter to Office of the Inspector General or OIG, you have 4 hours to do that reporting. You can listen first. You'll still make that time. You want to explain the options that the person has. You want to support their choices and ensure their safety. We do want to believe and support and respect and assist. What we don't want to do is doubt their stories or blame them for what happened or judge them for what happened or even punish them. Sometimes we don't have the words to say. And so I'll give you some considerations. You might want to say, I'm so sorry this happened to you. And thank you for telling me, because it's a really brave thing to tell someone. And I believe you. You can offer support. How can I help you? What do you need right now? If you are a mandated reporter, and I hope that you know if you are a mandated reporter, perhaps it's because of your role at an agency or organization that you're a mandated reporter. Maybe you have some specific licensure that requires you to be a mandated reporter. I hope you know if you are or not. What you can say is, I am a mandated reporter. I'll need to report information you share with me about abuse, neglect, or mistreatment to whoever your reporting organization is. Here I put OIG for Office of the Inspector General, or APS, Adult Protective Services, for investigation. You get to choose what information you share with me. I want to make sure that you are safe and know about the choices you have to get help. Just know that we don't start out with, I am a mandated reporter. We start out by providing that support. I'm sorry this happened to you. You're brave to tell. How can I help you? We also want to offer choice. If you are a mandated reporter, asking the person, would you like to make the report with me? Would you like to be in the room? Would you might like to make the phone call? Domestic violence takes away people's power and control. And during this process of responding to disclosures, you can help them begin to take steps to regain their power and control. You can also offer support. There's a crisis center or victim services in town that could help you. Would you like me to help you connect with them? So letting people know. And every county in Illinois is covered by victim services. Reminders with responding to disclosures. Disclosures are judgment-free zones. Leave your judgment at the door. We want to listen first and then offer support and choice. And remember, people's reactions are not always visible. It can be really difficult to hear just a really a horrible story about domestic violence, and yet the person in front of you is telling you, like they would tell you they went to the zoo yesterday. Reactions are not always visible. Our expectations and judgment influence how we are going to respond. We know that abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation takes away power and control, and our informed response is based on supporting the person to take power and control back. So we have our individual responses, and then we have a system response. So within Illinois, we have mandated reporting, whether that is to Office of the Inspector General, for people living in certain residential settings, for people receiving community day services, for people receiving home and community-based waiver supports. There's also Adult Protective Services, or APS, for older adults age 60 and older, and people with disabilities living in the community. For some people living in certain residential situations, there are the Illinois Department of Public Health, or IDPH, is the mandated reporting requirement. And then the criminal justice system can always be contacted. The nice thing is we have a bit of a cheat sheet, as you will, on who do you call. So you don't have to remember all the different things. This lays it out for you. It goes through who was abused, where did it happen, and who do you report to. Hopefully, it's a no wrong door system. If you happen to call the wrong place, once you're giving the information, they will realize, yes, this is the right place to report, or no, you really need to call this other place. All crimes can be reported to the police. In this resource, we also include the information and website plus numbers for rape crisis centers and domestic violence centers. So we have our individual or agency organization response. We have mandated reporting as a response, and then victim services as a response. We have domestic violence programs within Illinois. All counties are covered. The domestic violence programs offer medical and legal advocates. They offer counseling and shelter services. All services are free and confidential. If you don't know where your local victim service center is, you can easily find it by going to www.ilcadv.org. I really recommend that people know where their local victim services are located. Some victim services are dual agencies, so they offer both rape crisis and domestic violence services. There are a couple of those in Illinois. Otherwise, they are separate violence programs. One of the things that we heard from a self-advocate at the beginning of our Envision Illinois journey was this: people need to take time and listen, to be there. It's not something that just takes a few minutes, but rather you need a long time to talk about it. People should listen and let you talk, and not interrupt or stop you or ask a lot of questions. People want support. We know that healing is possible. People are resilient and they can recover even severe trauma with supports. The survivor is always the expert on how they feel. And sometimes it's hard to give up a behavior that has kept you safe in the past. And when we are thinking about maybe putting programs into place, maybe behavior modification programs, are we doing this in response to trauma? So for example, I've supported people who did not take showers or baths. And so we try the showering or bathing programs. And then through a long time of relationship building, we found out that the domestic violence happened while they were in the shower and in the bathtub. And you know what? I understand you not wanting to take a shower or a bath. And me putting in a program into place to force you to do that was not the right thing. The same for someone who had really bad breath, and we were trying to get them to brush their teeth and do their hygiene. And then the person said, it's better to have bad breath than no breath. Because if I have bad breath, nobody's going to want to get close enough to me to hurt me. It was for protection. So again, it can be hard to give up a behavior that's kept you safe in the past. Ask the person what you could do to make them feel more comfortable and how you can best work with them. Get to know the person. I think this is important no matter what we are providing to people. To heal, a person needs three things: safety, empowerment, and connection with others. Also want to maintain boundaries, not get too involved. I really like this quote because it sums things up. No intervention that takes power away from the survivor can possibly foster his or her recovery. It is the survivor's work to do. It is our role to provide support, but it is the survivor's work to do. And so I like this particular description, a visual description of healing. So on the left-hand side, many people think that healing looks like this. You have this traumatic incident, you get a little support, and then you are on this nice, straight, non-curvy line up to healing. Well, I wish it was that way. What healing actually looks like is it's a 1 step forward, 2 steps back, going from side to side, and hopefully with connection and empowerment and relationships, it moves up into healing. But at any time, people can be triggered and go back to the start. And so that's where our support can also come in. Healing can take a long time. A promising practice tip is we need to presume the clients we serve have a history of traumatic stress and exercise universal precautions. Well, I'm going to take that 1 step further. We need to presume everybody we come into contact with, whether it's at work or out in our personal lives, at Walmart, at Aldi, at the gas station, we need to presume that people we engage with have a history of traumatic stress and exercise universal precautions. And how do we bring Envision Illinois into this? Well, here's how. Our goal is to reduce the prevalence and increase the numbers served. And so that's what this grant was all about. We started it in 2013. We've been going for 11 years now. We focus on people with disabilities and deaf people, and we're doing it statewide. From our needs assessment, we heard from survivors that they want a collaborative process, which results in a warm handoff, where 2 providers consult with each other and both work with the person together. So there's an integration of services. And they also said we need to be with people we can trust, right? That's what people need to heal. We need comfortable, accessible, safe places. And when we thought about that collaboration, we thought about who are our partners, who are our potential partners. And because Envision Illinois is statewide, we looked at statewide entities who engage with people with disabilities and deaf people. And so our partners include the Illinois Department of Human Services and its 3 divisions, the Division of Rehab Services, the Division of Mental Health, and the Division of Developmental Disabilities. We also engage or have a partner in the Illinois Department on Aging, the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the Illinois Network of Centers for Independent Living, the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance, Blue Tower Solutions, and finally, the Illinois Family Violence Coordinating Councils at the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. We have updated protocols for prosecutors and for law enforcement for them to better engage with people with disabilities who have experienced domestic violence. We've had a lot of accomplishments over our 11 years. Self-advocate engagement has been huge. Self-advocates, survivors, people with disabilities and deaf people, they have been at the core of everything we do. We've also done responsiveness reviews to make sure that, as much as possible, domestic violence agencies are widening the welcome for people with disabilities and deaf people who are seeking services. We've had community engagement, trainings like the one I'm doing today, and we have a really cool resource corner on the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence's website. So if you're someone who enjoys a deeper dive into things, we've got you covered. On our Envision Illinois website, we have on the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence's website, we have an Envision Illinois section. You can search by type of resource. We have a lot of resources and we continue to add them. Everything from case studies and scenarios to different webinars to fact sheets and handouts. Have lots of good information. So what you do is you go to the resource corner. I've provided the link here. There's a little search box. Maybe you want to know more about safety planning. So you type in safety planning and 5 different resources come up, and then you can check them out. We want to leave a legacy long after our funding for this project is over. Collaboration is the path, and I'm going to say that collaboration is the only path forward to safety, justice, and healing, because no one organization offers all the services survivors with disabilities need and the aftermath of violence. And no one organization possesses all the expertise needed to provide those services in a way that is safe and accessible. We have to do it together. We have to know what resources we have in the community to connect survivors to. And that's the beauty of it. We don't have to know or do everything. I know that many of our agencies have different counselors and therapists on staff, and that's amazing. Offering survivors the opportunity to go to a domestic violence center to get that support is also very important. So I would say don't try and keep it all in-house. Offer people the option and the opportunity and the support to receive services through the domestic violence agencies. And we also talk to domestic violence agencies. Who are the disability providers in your community? So when you have someone who comes for services who might be needing some additional support due to their disability, who can you reach out to? So knowing the different players in your community is important. And if you haven't had that collaboration with them, maybe today's the day to start that. Your support, if it hasn't already made a difference, both personally or professionally, your support can and will make a difference. Our project director is Jacina Williams. She is with the Illinois Department of Human Services, and her email address is on the screen. So at this point, I am going to end the show. I am going to stop sharing. I'm going to turn on my video and ask if anyone has any questions, comments, or contributions that they would like to share. I will share this PowerPoint presentation with Jody so that she can share it with all of you or put it onto, I don't know if you have an intranet or something like that, but I will make sure that you get this presentation as well.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Does anyone have any questions? I know it's a lot of information to take in, and I invite you to just sit with the information for a bit and then think about, how does this work for me, whether it's professionally, whether it's personally. Maybe you look at your policies and procedures. How do we support people who disclose abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation? And I'm talking beyond the, you have to report it, right? How do we support that person in a way that begins to start the healing journey? I will also share that there is legislation that allows for people with guardians, people with legal guardians, to receive counseling services without guardian approval. And that's huge, because sometimes the guardian is the perpetrator. Sometimes the guardian knows who the perpetrator is. Sometimes people don't want their guardians knowing all their business. So having access to services without guardian knowledge or consent is important. And that's both for domestic violence services and for rape crisis services.
Good to know. Thank you for sharing that
Yes.
as well.
All right. Well, if there are no questions or comments, I thank you for allowing me to share a bit about Envision Illinois today. If you have any questions, you can ask me. Jody has my contact information. You can certainly ask Jacina Williams, who is the project director.
Appreciate that. And just as a reminder, the third part of our series that we are partnering with the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance, we have the webinar on supportive decision making on August 20th at 10 a.m. So that'll be a standalone webinar. So hopefully you can make that. If not, we will be recording that as well. So I just wanted to throw that in there and let you know. And then our next IDD committee meeting, Kim, I think is it September 10th? Yeah, September 10th at 10. So, but thank you so much, Krescene.
All right. Thank you.
Thank everyone for joining us today.
All right. Take care, all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.